A magnificent recovery, leading trophy. There's widespread sympathy for Leeds.
Chelsea supporters finally proved that it's not quicker by bus.
Dave Sexton didn't beg for attention, didn't shout to be heard, didn't brand himself to stay remembered. He stood in the same dugouts as icons, lifted silver with the same hands as legends, wrote history and watched others sign it. The noise never stopped for him. It circled the dribblers, the charmers, the ones football likes to put on posters. Sexton wasn't built for posters. He was built for control, for clarity, for the cold choices that hold teams together and tear dressing rooms apart. He never blinked, never flinched, but every decision came with a scar. In one chapter, he sent away the idols he'd once crowned. In another, a genius defied him, and glory vanished. Elsewhere, he brought results. Yet they turned on him for how they looked. And when the last door closed, no one even argued. He wasn't loved, he wasn't praised. But he was right, more often than anyone dared to admit. And still, the silence stayed. No banners, no parades. Just a memory, passed quietly between men who understand what it costs to stand alone. If you carry memory for the ones who were right too early, who led without applause, who were hated for their standards, subscribe. Because here, the games forgotten don't stay buried. Here, Dave Sexton rises. David Sexton was born on the 6th of April 1930, in the working class shadows of Islington, North London. His father Archie was a boxer, not a showman, but a soldier. A man who wore his bravery in silence, once decorated with the George Medal for courage under fire. That was the home Dave came from, a house where toughness didn't shout, where values didn't need noise, where discipline arrived before breakfast, and excuses never made it to dinner. He began his football life the hard way, not as a wonder kid, not as a name passed between scouts, but as a centre forward who worked in the shadows. He didn't dazzle. He studied. Even when he played, he watched like a manager. The goals came, quiet and steady. At West Ham, he found his sharpest form, driving in goals not for glory, but to understand what made defenders panic. At Brighton, he helped win promotion in 1958, but he didn't lift the trophy like others did. He stood behind it thinking, taking notes no one saw. His boots touched the pitches of Luton, Orient, Crystal Palace. But wherever he went, he left no drama, no scandal, just questions. Why does this system fail? Why does this shape leak? By the time most players were chasing coaching badges, Sexton was already coaching from inside his skull. His playing career wasn't forgotten. It was dissected. Because the real David Sexton wasn't made with a striker's boots. He was made with a strategist's silence. And football didn't see him coming. He didn't arrive with noise. He arrived with notebooks. In 1967, Dave Sexton became Chelsea's coach, not to decorate the dressing room with slogans, but to reorganise the chaos. He studied players like puzzles and built a system no one saw coming. By 1969, he was manager, and the club, riddled with egos, potential, and internal fractures, suddenly had shape. Peter Osgood called him a thinker. Alan Hudson said he was strict but sharp. But Sexton didn't ask for loyalty. He demanded discipline. And for a while it worked. Chelsea lifted the FA Cup in 1970, and then the Cup Winners' Cup in 1971, beating Real Madrid. It was the greatest era the club had ever seen, and Sexton had done it without chasing limelight. But glory has a short memory, and discipline wears thin on men who want to dance. The dressing room began to resist. Hudson and Osgood clashed with him, not with fists, but with flair, and with freedom he didn't tolerate. Sexton didn't shout. He just exiled. One by one, the princes of Stamford Bridge were pushed out. Names the fans adored, players who built the empire, cut loose without fanfare. The fans began to turn. The board hesitated. And in 1974, just 3 years after European triumph, Sexton was gone. Silently. No press conference. No grand farewell. Just a whisper. That the man who made Chelsea winners could no longer control what he'd created. Some called it harsh. Some called it overdue, but Sexton never explained. He just walked away, leaving behind silverware, shattered trust, and a team that would take decades to rise again. Because that's what happens when discipline wins trophies, but loses the room. After Chelsea, he vanished into thought, not into retirement, but into reflection. And when Queen's Park Rangers called in 1974, he didn't return as a man trying to prove himself. He returned as a man who knew exactly what he wanted to build. QPR wasn't a powerhouse. They weren't rich. They didn't have stars. But they had something Sexton craved. Silence. No egos, no kings. Just a squad willing to listen. And into that silence he poured his method. Patterns, movement, minimalism. Every player became a gear, and Sexton engineered the whole machine. Stan Bowles was the fire. Jerry Francis, the spine. Don Givens, the hammer. Sexton made them all work like they'd been built in the same factory. And the results? Stunning. QPR played the cleanest football in England. Not flashy, but precise, geometrical. Controlled chaos disguised as calm domination. In 1975-76, they came within a single point of the First Division title. 1 point. One misstep. 1 week where Liverpool pulled ahead. And the dream was gone. Some say Sexton never got over it. Not because of pride, but because perfection was that close. But even in near victory, problems stirred. Bowles was brilliance wrapped in rebellion. Francis had his own ideas. And behind the beauty, tensions brewed. Still, Sexton didn't explode. He never needed volume. Just a suitcase. In 1977, with QPR already fraying, he left. Not to rest, but to take on the biggest stage of all. A stage that had broken greater men. Manchester United. They thought he was the answer. But they never really wanted the question he came to ask. When Dave Sexton walked through the gates of Manchester United in 1977, he brought a mind sharpened like a scalpel, but found himself in a cathedral that worshipped drama, not diagrams. He wasn't made for theatre. He wasn't built for noise. Sexton wanted discipline. He wanted movement without show. He wanted obedience to a higher footballing logic. But this was United, a club that thrived on flair, chaos and rebellion. He inherited Lou Macari, Sammy McIlroy, Steve Capel. Players who had fire in their boots but weren't used to freezing for structure. Sexton's football didn't sparkle. It suffocated. He was building control, but the fans were screaming for courage. He was preaching shape, but the terraces wanted soul. In 4 seasons, he brought them to an FA Cup final and finished runners-up in the league. He brought in Ray Wilkins, his trusted student, and gave Joe Jordan a role that fit his menace. But it didn't matter. Even when the results improved, the crowd turned colder. It wasn't about points. It was about poetry. And Sexton didn't write poems. He wrote formulas. In 1981, after 7 straight wins to end the season, they still sacked him. No banners, no farewell, just silence. The same silence he had once found useful, now used against him. And in the halls of Manchester United, they remembered him not for what he built, but for what he lacked. He still had ideas, still had his order, still had his code. But by the time Dave Sexton arrived at Coventry City in 1981, football had moved on. Not forward, just faster. He took over a club chasing ghosts, lost between fading ambition and a squad half-built, half-broken. They thought they were getting a mentor, a professor, a man who'd teach them to rise. But they got silence. They got repetition. They got a coach stuck in a chessboard while the league had become a street fight. Sexton wanted shape. They wanted survival. He wanted obedience. They wanted oxygen. He brought in players who could think, but found too many who only ran. He tried to teach balance, but met chaos that didn't care for balance anymore. The dressing room grew distant. The words stopped landing, and the man who once ruled tactics was now seen as a relic in a world of noise. In 1983, after 2 long seasons, he was dismissed without drama. No rebellion, no scandal. Just the quiet thud of a door closing. Coventry was the last club he truly managed. The last place that tried and failed to understand the kind of mind that needed time, trust and silence to win. But football was no longer a place for silence, and so Sexton disappeared. Not with disgrace, but with the worst thing football gives a man like him: indifference. When the club stopped listening, the country called. But not for fame, not for parades, for something rarer. Wisdom. In 1984, they handed him England's future, the under-21 squad. And Dave Sexton did what he always did. He taught. For 12 quiet years, he shaped the raw, the reckless, the almost. From 1977 to 1990 and 1994 to 1996, he mentored names that would light up stadiums, players who would win headlines. But who first learned how to think under him? He built UEFA U21 winning sides in 1982 and 1984, beating Spain in the final. An entire generation shaped without a whisper of credit. No statue, no banner, just results. But that was always his way. Even as a player, the numbers spoke. 69 league goals in 187 appearances. A striker with clinical timing, who hit 27 goals for West Ham, 26 for Brighton, 11 for Palace, 1 for Luton, 4 for Leyton Orient goals that didn't need fireworks, just netting. And yet, that part of him faded behind the manager's suit. Because Sexton never screamed his past, he just used it to sharpen others. Inside FA corridors, his football notebooks were passed around like scripture. His thoughts on movement, space, discipline. He was the man future managers quietly quoted but rarely named. Because football doesn't archive wisdom, it archives noise. And Dave Sexton, he never wanted to be archived, he wanted to be useful. So he kept teaching, even when no one asked. He didn't go out with fireworks, didn't give speeches, didn't announce a farewell tour. Dave Sexton simply stepped back, the way he always had. After 1996, after the under-21s, he was still there. Inside the FA, advising in silence, watching the game drift somewhere louder, somewhere younger. And then the silence became real. In his later years, the cruelest betrayal for a man whose genius lived in thought, whose mind had always been his sharpest weapon. From the touchline to a care home in Surrey, from tactical boards to forgotten faces, the fade was slow, the days longer than the nights. Passed away on 25 November 2012, aged 82 with no statue, no stand, no chance echoing his name. Just a few lines in the papers, a few old players who remembered the training drills, the quiet discipline, the way he looked you in the eye and made you better, without ever raising his voice. He had a mind sharper than most managers ever dared. A teacher in tactics, a builder of systems, a mentor to names that outgrew his own. 3 children, a private life wrapped in modesty, a man who never sold his story because the pitch had always been enough. He didn't belong to the age of branding. He belonged to the days when results spoke, when discipline meant everything, and when victory didn't need to be loud. Behind the coaching manuals, beneath the silver one, there was always something unresolved. A tension, a resistance, a man too complex to be easy, too principled to be popular. There were whispers, about players he froze out, about feuds he never explained, and about clubs that never fully understood what they had, until he was gone. But for those who know the game, who respect the difficult men who never bent, Dave Sexton never disappeared. He stayed in the angles of the training ground, in the silence before the final instruction is given, in the memory of football before it started performing. If you remember the minds who never chased applause, subscribe. Because here, the quiet ones aren't forgotten. Here they're finally heard.